Today, Mark Carney walked into Rideau Hall in Ottawa, placed his hand on a Bible, and was sworn in as the Prime Minister of Canada for the second time. And before the ink on that oath was dry, before the photographers had packed their cameras, before the diplomatic congratulations had finished arriving from allied capitals around the world, Carney stepped to the microphone and said something that no newly sworn-in leader of a G7 nation has said in living memory at the moment of their inauguration. He said the old relationship between Canada and the United States is over. Not strained, not damaged, not under review. Over, his word, delivered calmly, without theatrics, without anger, in the measured cadence of a man who spent 13 years as a central banker and who does not say things he does not mean. And the reason that sentence matters so much, the reason it is already reverberating through financial markets and diplomatic cables and editorial boards from London to Tokyo, is that Mark Carney is not a politician who stumbled into this crisis. He is an economist who saw it coming, who built his entire electoral campaign around it, who won a landslide mandate from Canadian voters, specifically because they believed he understood what was happening better than anyone else in the room. And what is happening, measured in actual dollars and actual policy decisions, is staggering in its speed and its scale. In the 12 months since Carney first took office in March of 2025, Canada has signed 12 new trade deals on 4 continents, reduced its canola oil tariffs with China from 85% to 15%, cut Chinese electric vehicle tariffs from 100% to 6.1%, signed a bilateral free trade agreement with Indonesia that was the first ever between Canada and an ASEAN member state, announced a $70 billion investment partnership with the United Arab Emirates, reached a preliminary agreement with Qatar, begun negotiating with India, and championed a proposal to link the European Union with the Trans-Pacific Partnership to create a new trading bloc of 1.5 billion people that deliberately excludes the United States. Every single one of those moves was made in direct response to what Trump started doing to Canada on February 1st of 2025, when he imposed a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy, citing illegal immigration and narcotics flows across the northern border as justification. A justification that Canadian customs data, American DEA seizure records, and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection's own statistics all contradict, given that Canada accounts for approximately 1% of fentanyl seized at American ports of entry, with the overwhelming majority coming through the southern border with Mexico. Carney did not respond to that provocation with anger, and he did not respond with appeasement. He responded with geometry, methodically redrawing the map of Canadian trade relationships so that by the time he stood at that podium in Rideau Hall today, Canada's economic survival no longer depended on whether Donald Trump was in a good mood. And now, today, on the same day, he is sworn into his second term with a stronger mandate than his first. Canada's $22 billion in retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, computers, cast iron, and consumer goods are active. The World Trade Organization has formally received Canada's dispute filing against the United States, and Carney has set a specific and unprecedented condition for any resumption of trade talks with Washington. The United States must show, in his exact words, respect and make credible and reliable commitments to free and fair trade before he will sit down at any table. He is not bluffing, and the financial markets know he is not bluffing because they have watched him for a year now, and they have seen every single thing he said he would do get done. Let's go back to January of this year, because that is where you begin to understand the architecture of what Carney built and why today's swearing in is not a ceremonial moment, but a strategic one. On January 20th, 2026, Carney stood at the podium of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in front of the assembled leaders of the global economy, and delivered what has since been compared by multiple commentators and at least 2 former prime ministers to Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in terms of its historical weight and geopolitical clarity. And he did it without once mentioning Donald Trump's name. He said the rules-based world order that had governed international relations since the end of World War II had experienced a rupture, not a transition, his exact words, and that great powers had begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited, and that middle powers, countries like Canada, could not continue to pretend that integration with an unpredictable great power was mutual benefit when integration had become become the source of their subordination. The room gave him a standing ovation, which almost never happens at Davos. And the next morning, Trump responded from the same stage by saying, Canada lives because of the United States, and that Canadians should be grateful, and then revoked Carney's invitation to his Board of Peace, a diplomatic snub so petty and so transparently retaliatory that it functioned as confirmation of everything Carney had just said. Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's chief communications director during some of the most consequential diplomatic moments of the last 30 years, called Carney's Davos speech one of the best and most important speeches of recent times and real leadership. And he used those words before knowing that Trump would validate the speech's thesis within 24 hours by doing exactly what the speech described. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, said that numerous leaders from the United States privately sent him the transcript of Carney's speech saying, wow. American governors reading a Canadian prime minister's speech and saying, wow, in private because they could not say it in public is a data point about the current state of American political leadership that speaks for itself. Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer of Australia, called the speech stunning and said it was very impactful, thoughtful, and certainly widely shared and discussed in his government. Australia, one of America's closest and oldest allies, reading a Canadian speech about breaking from American economic dependence as a blueprint, Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, wrote on social media, very important and very well-put remarks by Canadian PM Mark Carney. And Bildt, who navigated Sweden through its own complicated relationship with American foreign policy for decades, does not say things like that casually. This is the man who walked into Rideau Hall today for his swearing in and said the old relationship between Canada and the United States is over. Now let's look at what that declaration actually means in practice, because the numbers are more dramatic than the rhetoric. Canada sent 77% of its total exports to the United States in 2024, a level of economic dependence that Carney himself has described as a vulnerability. One basket, one customer, one relationship, and Carney's stated goal, confirmed today in his remarks after the swearing-in ceremony, is to double Canada's non-U.S. exports within the next decade, which would mean redirecting hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade away from American buyers and toward European, Asian, and South American markets. The China deal alone unlocks, according to Carney's own figures cited at Davos, more than $7 billion in new export markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, fish harvesters, and agricultural workers, and the canola oil tariff reduction from 85% to 15% is not a symbolic gesture. It is a structural market shift that gives Canadian canola producers price-competitive access to the world's largest agricultural market for the first time since China imposed punitive tariffs on Canadian canola in 2019 in retaliation for Canada's arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. The Chinese electric vehicle tariff reduction from 100% to 6.1% is even more strategically significant because it inverts the entire logic of Trump's China policy. Trump spent 4 years building tariff walls against Chinese EVs to protect American and Canadian auto manufacturers, and Canada just opened its market to those same vehicles at preferential rates, which means Chinese EVs priced at levels that American manufacturers cannot match will be available to Canadian consumers, while Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian goods simultaneously make Canadian-assembled vehicles more expensive for American buyers. That is not an accident, and it is not a side effect. It is a calculated repositioning of Canada as a country that plays both sides of the U.S.-China rivalry, extracting value from each relationship rather than subordinating itself entirely to American strategic preferences. And it is exactly what Carney told the world he was going to do at Davos when he said, "We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be." Trump responded to the China deal by threatening a 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Canada became what he called a drop-off port for Chinese products. And Carney's response was to stand in Parliament the next day and say Canada is not pursuing a free trade deal with China, explain the specific terms of the canola and EV arrangement, note that Trump had made a structurally similar deal with Xi Jinping at the South Korea summit last summer, in which the United States cut some tariffs on China, while Beijing moved to allow rare earth exports and lift a pause on purchasing American soy, and point out that he had signed 12 new trade deals on 4 continents in 6 months. When you are a newly sworn-in prime minister with a fresh electoral mandate, those are not defensive talking points. They are a policy portfolio. And today, in his remarks after the ceremony, Carney was precise about what comes next. He said his government's primary focus is on the Canadian economy, not on managing Washington's moods, and he said he is prepared to meet with Trump when there is respect for Canadian sovereignty, a condition he has stated publicly and consistently since taking office, and has not walked back once, despite significant pressure from the business community, from opposition politicians, and from Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who told Fox News that Carney had been very aggressively walking back his Davos remarks in a private phone call, a characterization that Carney immediately and publicly contradicted by saying he told Trump in his exact words, "I meant what I said." That exchange captures the entire dynamic. Bessent telling Fox News that Canada was backing down, Carney going on camera the same day to say he was not, the White House claiming a diplomatic victory that the other party to the conversation explicitly denied, and the Canadian public watching and deciding in the election that followed to give Carney a stronger mandate than the one he had before. The Americans who are watching this most carefully are not in the White House. They are in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana and Minnesota and the other states whose manufacturing sectors are structurally integrated with Canadian supply chains and whose governors have been receiving private messages from Canadian officials making clear that the $22 billion in retaliatory tariffs active today are the beginning, not the ceiling. Carney said today the decades-long process of ever closer economic relationship with the United States is over, and that Canada's economic strategy is to change rapidly. And the 12 deals on 4 continents in 6 months, the WTO filing, the China partnership, the EU CPTPP bridge proposal, and the $22 billion in tariffs that took effect at midnight are not a threat or a negotiating position. They are a year's worth of evidence that he means exactly what he says.